My name's David Primrose and I work for the Diocese of Lichfield. One of the most exciting things that happened a few years ago was that it was in Stafford that we piloted a new resource called GraveTalk. And that was just an opportunity for us to help people talk about death and dying. And that's why it's very good to be back here today, just to talk through for you all just how GraveTalk and similar resources can really help people address issues around death and dying and people's hesitance and lack of confidence sometimes in talking about what is just a fundamental part of life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a little bit about why for us as a church, GraveTalk is a very natural resource to be using, and then to follow on by actually talking about GraveTalk itself, and then finally invite us to share together the different things that we know is happening during this Dying Matters Awareness Week. The Diocese of Lichfield covers all of Staffordshire, as well as most of the Black Country and much of Shropshire. So it's quite a large diocese. And within it, one of the things that we've been committed to do is actually say, how do we actually find a way of making us confident around death? We've been looking to make sure that in each community, the church congregation can be a death-confident congregation. And that sense of being a death-confident congregation, from a church point of view, should seem obvious. We're places where very often the church building's surrounded by graveyard that, if nothing else, speaks about death and our recognition of that. It's a place where the church celebrates a commitment to Jesus Christ, around whom life, death and resurrection is absolutely fundamental. And it's a place where year by year communities have come together to mark that really important transition when a member of a community dies, how we're actually going to be acknowledging that, managing that, coping with that, and all the rituals that go along with it. But what is a reality of today is that many people have actually found other ways to acknowledge that transition of life and death. And the church no longer is in that central place. People very often turn to civil celebrants who have got an excellent record in terms of managing how to help people cope with death of dying. People
you can't hear on the computer, use your phone.
And just to say, if you do find if you do hear your own voice as we're talking, that probably means that you haven't muted your device, and you should find on the top left-hand side a green button that you can turn red by clicking on it, and then that will help. So thank you very much indeed. As we're going through, please do, if you have any comments at the beginning, do send them through on chat, and about a third of the way through we'll stop and just share those comments before we go on to look at GraveTalk itself. Part of the reality of where we live in is that many of us, myself included, age 63, are classic baby boomers. And one of the things about baby boomers is that we have grown up in a very privileged time of life. We've grown up with a great sense in which we're unique and special, that we want to be different, that we want to make a contribution that is outstanding, and that we don't actually go with what has actually happened before. The generation that knew Woodstock isn't going to end its life quietly. It's going to go out with a bit of colour and a bit of a bang. And those of us who are baby boomers at the moment, and I guess quite a few of us who are listening might be in that category, are also in that acute reality of having our own in-laws dying. Many of us, I took my mother-in-law's funeral just a few weeks ago. We're in that situation of trying to mark the end of life of those who are our parents generation. In doing so, very often, what people are doing is they're talking about the celebration of the life of, rather than a funeral. And so there's a sense in which very often as we're trying to engage with death, we move quickly away from it and try and celebrate life. And that's good, and that's right, and that's proper. But what it does do is it gives us very little opportunity at that critical stage of life to address the whole issue of grief. And the way in which very often we will try to encourage people to wear bright colours at funerals, will try to do things that are unique and different, avoids that very human phenomenon that grief is a natural part, an essential part, a crucial part of what happens around death and dying. I would say alongside this, that there is a huge commercial interest in the business of managing death and dying. And in doing so, the commercial interest very often pushes and promotes that which is unusual and unique and special, and allows us to invest heavily in ways in which we're flagging out the specialness of the person that we're remembering, but takes away from that space to go through that very natural grief cycle. And indeed for ourselves and many others as we're talking, that may be something that's quite important. And if at the end of this time it is right for you to revisit grief, then I do hope you'll be able to find the right people or the right places to support you through that. One of the ways that people have tried to think about death and dying is to always draw down some contemporary image, some way in which we're making sense of what is beyond making sense of. Several years ago, I was vice chair of a charity, Winston's Wish, that was concentrating on child bereavement. And by introducing a very simple way in which people could think of the person who had died as a star in the sky, then people were able to take something that is very eternal, cosmic out there, and use that as an image to try to handle that transitional moment. My own sense around Staffordshire at the moment is there's a huge investment in angels, not in angels in the way that I would know about them in a church context, but angels in the way in which people talk about your Aunt Sarah meeting my Uncle Tom in heaven, in a way in which both their individual personalities is maintained and yet somehow redeemed. So they're still the same characters, but their slightly awful side is somewhat blunted, and their more humorous or endearing side is exaggerated. And the way in which people are using the language of angels as a way, once again, of trying to say, we've got to have ways, images, that will actually carry us beyond this transitional point of death and dying. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge that in whatever way we are in society managing this transition, it's beyond just mere words. It's into images. It's into something that is rich in meaning. Because there's something about death that includes the whole age of dependency. People of my own age may be living for another quarter of a century, but towards the latter part of that, we are going to find ourselves very, very often in a situation where we're no longer independent, we're no longer self-sufficient, we're no longer in charge of our own affairs. We've lost that great aspiration that people have, where we're autonomous, able to make our own decisions with enough resources to follow them through. And the sense of dependency is something that awaits us as we approach death, and for which many people have quite a deep and ingrained fear. And it's pulling away from dependency that very often makes people pull away from engaging with death. So one of the things that we're doing during this Dying Awareness Week, and should be doing throughout the year, is actually redeeming something around what it is to be a human being mutually dependent upon other human beings. And in that sense of relationship, we can actually begin to redeem and reclaim something of the fullness of a person, which, from my own understanding, is not the fullness of an individual independent, but the fullness of somebody who's in a sense and a set of healthy mutual relationships with many, many others. It's probably worthwhile now, because next week we come across Dementia Action Week. It used to be Dementia Awareness Week. Now it's Dementia Action Week. And dementia is such a major impact upon our society, not just in terms of numbers. At the moment, it's estimated that a third of those who are born will end their life living with dementia, but also because it challenges what, for many of us, we would see as being a hyper-cognitive society. It would challenge a society that's based on thinking as being an absolute requirement, and to be able to freely make their own decisions is taken to be what it means to be a person. And one of the things that happens around dementia is the impairment of thinking, the damage to the brain function, means that people are no longer able to inhabit that space of being totally in control of their own thinking processes. And until we as a society change the way in which we value thinking, we value a person in a holistic way, we're always going to find this fear of dementia causing us to pull back away from what it means to be able to approach the end of a life with confidence. Just a couple of years ago, it was my father who had dementia for several years, who died, and that final process for us as a family was quite demanding as we thought through with him what it means to be somebody whose thinking processes are already being compromised. 7, 8, 9 years, that's the length of time that most of us can anticipate living with a recognized, diagnosable disability before the end of our lives. That's something that we actually need to hold on to and engage with. And because that sense of disability can sometimes be perceived as being diminishment, that it needs to be approached with enormous care and sensitivity. One of the things that does happen as we approach life is the end of life is very often this a sense of disengagement, of detachment, of a beginning to actually no longer hold on to all that we've had ourselves. And so a sense in which those who already are living with a disability in the middle of their life, that they've actually got something so important, so significant to teach all of us as about how we can actually be living fulfilled lives with whatever particular disability is either ours now or will be ours to come. But that cannot actually take away from what all of us know is the huge correlation between an increased incidence of depression in later life. And that can be for people who've been depressed earlier, gone through episodes of depression throughout their life, or something that comes quite new. And the way in which we as a community, as a people, need to be able to articulate that, make sure it's not only within the GP surgery, but in a much wider context, that we're able to talk freely about death and the prospect of death. For many people will be deep depression. And in looking at that, there isn't an easy way to cheer people up. It's an acknowledgement. One of the aspects that comes towards the latter part of life is when one can reflect on all that has happened, and one can recognize quite pragmatically that the ability to change things, to make outcomes different, is very, very limited. And so that pragmatism is around. What I'm going to do in a moment is I'm just going to pause and invite my colleagues around the room just to read out some of the comments that some people have made. And that's just going to take us on quite quickly from there into introducing GraveTalk as a resource that you could use, or you could arrange to be used in your community as a way in which people can talk about death and dying. So just at the moment, just turning to my colleagues, any particular comments that you'd like to read out that people have sent in through their chat?
Thanks, David. Unfortunately, we have been experiencing a few technical issues. So some people have seen on the chat feed that we have had some people, unfortunately, not being able to hear the session. So our colleague Sarah is just trying to sort of figure out what the issues there. So we do apologise for that. We've sent a message out. We haven't actually had anybody send any comments through as yet. Thankfully, a colleague of mine who works in the Staffordshire Library Service, Scott, is really grateful that the presentation and the audio will actually be available to share later on, that he can share with his colleagues. But we, oh, sorry, just now I've just seen a message come through actually, which I'll read out. So this is from Nikki. at Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Tree's NHS Partnership Trust. And Nikki has said, I think we as a society fear death, and when we begin to talk about death, it's important for us to have considered our own fears prior to these discussions.
Nikki, that's a really helpful place to take us further on, because very, very often myself and my colleagues in the church, we're engaged with other people who are closer to death than we are. We're in a situation where perhaps starting out as a young curate, we're visiting somebody who already knows that their life is in its latter stage and they're likely to be dying long, long before us. And very often it's our own inhibitions, it's our own unreadiness to be blunt and open about death and dying that inhibits what we're able to offer, which is why the resource of GraveTalk is something that we've really encouraged the church to be using. As I said earlier, it was developed here in Stafford. A large number of churches came together and were able to pilot how it developed. We were able also to use Staffordshire University, Peter Kevin, there to actually evaluate the process. And as a result of that, it then got developed further, taken elsewhere, and has been rolled out nationally. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just talk through how you might want to have a GraveTalk session in your own community, in your own place. And then at the end of that, it may be that some people have got some practical questions about running a GraveTalk session, in which case I'll be able to answer those directly. GraveTalk, well, you may or may not like the title. I think it's probably the most, and indeed sometimes the only controversial thing around it. Why did we have to choose that as a title? It's a cafe-style talk about death, dying, and funerals. It picks up on a movement that is global called Death Cafe, where people will just come together and take the opportunity to talk about death and dying. But what we've done quite intentionally is we put it in a Christian context that gives it a framework. It's by no means restricted to Christians who are going to be able to enjoy it and find it valuable, but it is something that has that sense of packaging and framework that gives it a sense of security. And in that way, it's not something extra to just a group of friends coming together. There is guidance available, and there's a booklet you can purchase that will be a facilitator's guide that would talk you through how to run a GraveTalk session. What one looks for is a venue, and many of the venues are either church buildings or church halls, which are laid out with a number of different key attributes. I think the first of which would be tea and cake, because there is a sense in which just basic hospitality sets people at ease and allows them to actually chat more freely. So a church hall, church building, community centre, an opportunity for coffee and cake. And of course, one of the best things about church is it tends to be coffee and homemade cake. And in that context, you just invite people to come in and say to them, we're going to be talking for, and perhaps the whole session might get contained within a single hour. Because very much of what we find at the moment is we live in a society that's words, 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 it's very good to have some sense of images. So within the room, it's good to have a visual focus. That visual focus might include things like a candle, a cross, a picture of somebody who's recently died, an order of service from a recent funeral, might contain some words from a poem that are quite common at funerals, and laid out in a way so that as you are in the room, one is conscious that there's a visual focus for the whole topic of death and dying. If it's a church building, very often that's aided by perhaps stained glass windows or various artifacts that are around. But there is quite a sense in which make the room feel attractive, make the room feel somewhere that's got a visual richness to what one's going to be about. The person who's leading the session, and here it's particularly useful if you get somebody from the local church to do so, is able, as well as introducing it, to actually perhaps open with a short and a simple prayer, the sort of prayer that one could say amen to if I wanted to, or just hear said if that was more for your own situation. And in that prayer, it says to people, we're about to have a conversation about a topic that some of us find quite scary, but we're okay because our host is the church here who's got a confidence and experience, a legacy around dealing with death and dying. And because that context is there and it's said with a degree of confidence, then it allows the conversations to take place. One of the things we have to be quite keen on with our colleagues is to make sure that this is a conversation between people and each other. It's not a question and answer. It's not where the vicar's the expert. It's not where one's trying to tell people stuff. It's an opportunity to get people who maybe don't find it easy to talk about death and dying to start doing so. And so this is where the key part of the conversation takes place. This is where we have something that's called GraveTalk cards. Around a table, there might be ideally 4 people. Sometimes it's been 4 people who already know each other. Sometimes they've been familiar but don't really know each other, and sometimes they're quite strangers. And in the conversation, to start the conversation, there on the table are a pile of GraveTalk cards. It's worthwhile actually buying just maybe even 1 pack, and that you can distribute between the different sessions quite readily. In order to get the conversation started, the person just turns over a card. These cards belong to 5 different themes. And of course, if you're wise, you just kind of make sure that you have a mixture of different cards from different themes. The first theme's around life. What makes life special for you? Because when we are talking about death and dying, we're talking about the whole of our life and what value and meaning we find in it. The second is around death and around encouraging people to share memories they've had, perhaps of funeral services, of people who've died, of how they've actually found coming close to the experience of death in their life. The third is around society, because there are so many cultural expectations on how to deal with death. And we're in such a multicultural society, and indeed our own culture is changing at such a rate that it's really helpful to begin to flag up how culture deals with death and how comfortable we feel about that. There is a practicality around funerals, and sometimes people who've never been to a funeral can have quite a lot of confusion, quite a lot of basic questions, and so just a conversation around funerals. People, on the other hand, may already have got clear ideas about how they want their own funeral to be. And then grief, the reality of loss. There's no way that one can approach and stay with anything to do with death and dying without just having that acknowledgement of grief, which can sometimes begin long before somebody actually dies and definitely carries on long afterwards. So what happens is the person turns over their first card, and that little group, 4 people, just chat about it for as long as they want. And when they've finished with that card, they themselves just turn over another card. And if they don't like the question, they turn over another one. So one of the cards says, should people talk more about death and dying? And those 4 people together may say, oh, I like that, and they go talk. Or for some reason, they might not want to. I've got in my hand here a pack of cards, and randomly the first one here is, if you could choose where would you like to die? If you could choose, where would you like to die? So I mentioned earlier, I took my mother-in-law's funeral just recently. She was living us with 5 years, and just before she died, she made it quite clear that for her, she said, I know many people want to die at home, but I would like to die in hospital. And indeed, the evening that she came to die, the ambulance came, they took her into hospital, and indeed she died up in Stoke 4 hours later. And for us to know that she'd earlier said, that's where I'd like to die, made that whole process much easier for us. If I randomly take another card, it says, what has been most memorable about funerals you've been to? So lots of different cards addressing lots of different topics. And the whole purpose is not indeed to get ever a right answer, but just to give people the opportunity and the confidence that they would actually be able to talk about death and dying with people here in the room, and then indeed hope those conversations would take place afterwards. A GraveTalk session might, in terms of those conversations, might take around 40 minutes in terms of the conversations. Usually, it's not helpful for people who've just had a recent bereavement, because they are quite naturally dominated by that particular thought in the process. Usually, it's not helpful for people who've had perhaps a diagnosis of a terminal condition and are processing that themselves, because they may actually need more individual time to focus on that themselves. But very, very often in GraveTalk sessions, what people find is people go back about 18 months, 2 years, to talk about bereavements in that sort of timescale, and that actually helps make sure that the conversation's grounded. What I mentioned earlier is worthwhile repeating. It's not a question and answer session. It's not an occasion in which the vicar or anybody else is going to tell people what they could, might, or should be thinking. Sometimes people do run resources alongside. There may be a local funeral director involved. There may be a solicitor talking about wills. There may be a GP who's available to talk about some of the more medical aspects of issues. But that's an adjunct to, rather than part of, a GraveTalk session itself. And quite often when churches have run a GraveTalk session, on one occasion they think, let's do it again in 6 months' time. Let's do it again in 12 months' time. The end of a GraveTalk session, in my own experience, tends to come back first with the person who was the host actually saying, interrupting the conversations, apologizing to people, saying, I can hear you want to carry on talking, but we did say we'd stop now. And the opportunity to close with a prayer. Again, a prayer that actually just holds things in a particular Christian context without requiring people to opt into that themselves. And then at the end, people quite often do one of 3 different things. There's a group of people who will reasonably quietly leave the building. They go with their own thoughts. They may, during the time, have laughed a lot. Quite often there's a lot of laughter. But there may be some particular personal thought around death and dying that they take away with them. And that's fine. We are grown-ups, independent adults, able to be responsible for our own thinking. And those people leave with the blessing of whoever is holding that session. It seems quite important to offer an opportunity for people to do something in action. Now, it may be in a church one could actually light a little candle. It may be one could symbolically go across to something that's perhaps represents a tree and write down the name or the concern one has, perhaps my mum or our first child, or whatever one wants to write on a bit of paper and put on a tree as a gesture of expressing those thoughts. And I know that colleagues in church can be very imaginative, very creative in providing people with different ways in which they can express in some tangible form some particular thought that is the participants at the very end of that session. And that may go along with, if it's a church hall rather than a church building, an opportunity to go and have time within the church itself. The third group are the group that sometimes are the most problematic, because they're the group who just want to carry on talking. They've longed for an opportunity to talk as frankly and openly about death and dying. They haven't had the time till now. The person who's been host for the session has interrupted them, and as soon as the ending is over, they're back carrying on the conversation, and you actually have to turn the lights out and tell them to go home. The general experience around GraveTalk is that people find a huge sense of relief in being able to run have a time when they can talk about death and dying themselves. So if you think that GraveTalk is something that might be of use to yourself, then clearly you might just want to get the resources. They're available to purchase and run a session yourself. If you're not somebody who feels comfortable about the Christian context for a GraveTalk session, then I'm very, very happy to put you in touch with a colleague anywhere in Staffordshire who would actually be able to provide the context for you to actually hold and host such a GraveTalk session. Or it may be, as indeed many other people have done, is they've just taken the questions, the cards, and said, you know, these cards are asking basic human questions. Doesn't have to be in the context of a formal GraveTalk session, but can just be a conversation starter in any other place, and actually use them as such. But whatever way you find GraveTalk as a resource that could be used, I'd encourage you to use it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn to my colleagues in the room at the moment and ask them whether anybody's put any particular questions in, or indeed comments on the running of GraveTalk sessions, and then we'll try to address those for you.
Thanks, David. So during that session, we have had a few comments and a couple of questions through as well that I'm just going to go through. So some people may have seen that Scott from our library services has commented and said that libraries would actually act as a really good venue for GraveTalks. They already host coffee mornings and have various health and wellbeing activities across the 43 libraries in Staffordshire. So we would definitely agree with that. We think libraries would be a great place to have those discussions as well. We've had Vic Vanderberg, who's talked about the Dying in the Ditch sessions that are held at the King's Ditch, a micropub in Tamworth, that are a similar sort of format. So that's great. Thanks for that, Vic, to give us that information. We have had a question from Sarah saying, when people that you come across, do you find that people actually do know where it is that they want to die when they have those GraveTalk discussions, or is it something that people tend to sort of reflect on and work through over time?
That's really good, Sarah. Well, one of the great comments around GraveTalk is I'm not listening into those conversations. So I'm not actually hearing how people are responding to those questions. So what the questions do is they bring out into the open thoughts, considerations, questions that people are holding to themselves. There might be questions that they feel very comfortable talking about their family with, or indeed it may be that the fact they're in a situation perhaps with people who they count as friends rather than family, that they're able to articulate and talk through those particular details. Statistically, not in GraveTalk but across the nation, most people say they want to die at home, and those arrangements actually don't end up being able to be followed through for very, very many people. But I'm not quite sure within GraveTalk itself the answers, because the key thing around GraveTalk is not the answers, it's the questions. It's not the conclusions, it's the fact that people for 40 minutes are talking freely about death and dying, and that provides them with an opportunity to do that again later.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. We've also had a few other comments from people in the chat box. So Nikki from Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent NHS Partnership Trust has said, I would recommend a couple of resources for facilitators to read through first, on Death and Dying by Elaine Kubler-Ross, and Staring at the Sun by Irvine Yalom. So I've just put in a comment actually saying that I'm not aware of those, but it's certainly something we probably want to look into. So it's great to have that recommendation. Thanks, Kirsty. And also Julie from the County Council in the Families and Communities team. Julie said that I've thought about writing down my wishes around my own death and funeral for some time. It's something we never seem to get round to. I'm going to make a start on this today. I think it's important to take this responsibility. This gives our loved ones confidence in knowing what we want. If we're going to speak to others about it, we have to feel comfortable thinking about ourselves, which is absolutely right. So thanks for that, Julie. That's absolutely what we would want to get people to do really as a result of this campaign, is to think about death and dying, about their own death, and take the time to actually express their wishes and share them with their friends and family. So that's great. Okay, that's all we've had. I just want to sort of mention that we do have, if people aren't aware, we've got a variety of resources available on the Dying Matters Staffordshire website web pages. So if you type in Dying Matters Staffordshire, you'll be able to see all of the different resources that we've made available on there, just to sort of help facilitate those discussions as well and support any decisions that you might take. So I've just actually had another comment as well from Marie in Families and Children's at the County Council. Derby area has several of these as well. Our church just started Willow Tree. I'm very interested in this theme. Many years ago, I read the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Death and Dying, and I still use topics in the book. So that's great. Thanks for that, Marie. That's pretty useful to know about. Okay, so that's all we've had so far.
So in a moment, we'll end up with just, first of all, looking at the resources that Vicky mentioned there on Dying Matters staffs. And then we'll move on to an opportunity for you to share what you know is happening during Dying Matters Week. But just to pick up some of the comments earlier, as a church, we've also produced resources for people to talk about their own funeral arrangements, either on their own or in consultation with family, or indeed consultation with the church leader. I think one of the great and most significant features around GraveTalk, and would like to hold on to, is the sense in which people are having this conversation collectively. That the people are not just on their own reflecting about death and dying and funeral arrangements, but they're coming into a social context in which the conversation becomes okay. And if that social context of a conversation around death and dying being okay can come at the heart of a community, and that happens on a periodic basis, and I love the idea of our libraries being a place where perhaps once, twice a year, there's a GraveTalk session. If people know that we can be talking openly about death and dying, then when it becomes a particular issue for a person, a family, then already the taboo's been challenged, already the confidence begun to introduce, already people are able to say, we've talked about it in general, now we're talking about it in particular. So along with a fantastic range of resources are around for individuals to talk through and think through their own death, dying and funeral arrangements, I just love the opportunity. Death Cafe, what Vic was talking earlier around about Tamworth, the opportunity in the microbrewery there to talk about death and dying, or indeed GraveTalk itself to say, can we do this shared collectively, socially, rather than just in an isolated way? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask Vicky to draw our attention to some of the resources that the county's put together on Dying Matters staffs, and then invite you to let us know of what other resources you have. Sorry, I didn't mean resources. I meant resources as well, but also events taking place during this Dying Matters Awareness Week. So around the county, we can take maximum opportunity to take this as occasion that dying becomes a public matter.
Thanks, David. David, if you click onto the next slide in the presentation, it will show local resources, just so that people can then sort of see where they can. That's it. Thank you. So we've set up a web page on the Dying Matters website that's particularly for Staffordshire, so you can have a look at the different events and things that are going on and the resources that are available on that web page. So you'll see just on that slide there that we've listed a couple of them that we think you might be particularly interested in. A little short film on there that talks about a way to sort of start that conversation, an A5 booklet that we've put together as well about how to set up and run an end-of-life discussion that you might want to do yourselves, either within a sort of a new group or an existing group. There are different posters there as well that you can personalise for any events that you're creating yourself, so that you can promote them to people, and also some practical tools and leaflets, as I said, that gives some hints and tips about how you can start to have those conversations, but also get some of those practical matters underway. So all of that's available for you to access. On the next slide, which talks about further resources. So we've also got a page set up on our staffordshire.gov website as well, which again gives a list of other resources that you could use to promote any sort of discussions that you'd like to have yourselves, and again posters, leaflets. We've also put together a presentation actually that you can give to a community group in order to sort of get these discussions underway, and some screen images as well that you might want to utilise. The thing I was going to say, David, was maybe we want to mention to people where they can actually access the resources for the Grave Talks if they would like to purchase them.
So you could actually just Google GraveTalk cards and you can find them. They're produced by Church House Publishing, and we'll make sure that as the slides from this session are sent to all those who've logged on, we'll include that particular link in it as well.
That's great, thank you. So on the next slide, we've got some details about some events that are happening either today, if you're really proactive, or going on throughout the rest of the week. So you can see here that there's a Grave Talk sessioning happening in Uttoxeter at 2 p.m. at the Costa Coffee in Uttoxeter. All day there's the St Giles Information Day at Sutton Coldfield Supportive Care Centre in Sutton. And then you can see there we've got a few more events happening tomorrow and for the rest of the week in different parts of the county, and some of which we'll actually be going along to ourselves just to promote the Dying Matters Staffordshire campaign. I've got a few other events as well that I'm happy to read out. So today, Tuesday, there's the pop-up shop in Tamworth at the old Co-op Bank premises, 8 Coal Hill, Tamworth. The coffin will be back and we will pick up where we left off as last year. We also have a parrot to highlight the need to consider making plans for our pets, which is an interesting take on it, when we're no longer able to care for them. And that's part of the Dying Matters Information Day at the Sutton Coldfield Centre on Lynn Ridge Road. Just to make people aware, we will collate all of these events and we'll share them with you in an email this afternoon so that you can see what else is going on. There's various other pop-up shops sort of happening in Tamworth and in Newcastle as well that we'll be attending. So we'll get this information out to you after the webinar. So I think there's another event that you wanted to talk about, David, as well.
Just to say, within Staffordshire, we're delighted that we're hosting at the National Memorial Arboretum a national conference just looking at the contemporary challenge around ashes and bodies. It's something that very often people just draw back from or over-invest in. There's a whole movement around national burial ground that wants to be very much hand-on in terms of how we deal with bodies and their decomposition, what happens with them. There's a whole industry around how do we want to ensure that people can memorialise ashes in a way that will carry on lasting. And so quite a groundbreaking conference. It's in June 26th. If you're interested, the details are there. I'll be on the door, so you can introduce yourself to me on the way in. But that's just to say that people have got lots and lots of fresh thinking about that contemporary challenge to ashes and bodies. Indeed, I myself, with colleagues, are working on the possibility of a woodland burial ground, a natural burial ground for Staffordshire, and we'll be looking at things like that. So that's just a particular conference. If there's any other things that you want to draw people's attention to, please do mention them in a chat now, because what we're going to be doing in a moment is just drawing to a close. And in doing that, just want to acknowledge from everyone that talking about death and dying is something that we hesitate to do. And very often the reason that those free conversations that GraveTalk facilitate don't happen is because people are apprehensive about upsetting somebody else. There are lots and lots of ways in which that particular being upset around death and dying needs to come out and be shared with somebody who might be able to understand, put it in a context, help people have a deeper, better understanding of what their life's about. And clearly myself, as a former vicar, I'm very mindful of the value of conversations that have been predicated around hope or fear or distress or grief around issues of death and dying that can lead people into a deeper appreciation of what their life's around. So if you know of anybody or yourself is somebody who has found any aspect of this conversation difficult, then do seek somebody out to talk. The whole premise of GraveTalk is about these things are best when they're actually shared out loud. It could be a local minister, priest, or other faith leader. You could access a national organisation like Samaritans or Mind, or you could find somebody else. But if in any way you find this being something that's been personally significant, don't just leave it as it is, but take it somewhere else. And two people who'll be able to give you immediate information around what's happening in Staffordshire around Dying Matters Week. That's Vicar Rowley and David Sugden. And if you're able to look at the screen, their email details are there. If you want to contact them by email, it's vicky.rowley@staffordshire.gov.uk, david.sugden@staffordshire.gov.uk. I'm going to pass over to Vicky for final comments on how we'll be following up after this webinar.
That's great. Thank you, David. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through the presentation. Hopefully that's been insightful for everybody in terms of the GraveTalk process, but also kind of hopefully inspiring for people to actually have those open and honest conversations with friends and family, with loved ones, with people that you engage with on a day-to-day basis. Or if you want to then actually set up a sort of GraveTalk type session or a discussion about death and dying, then hopefully we've inspired you to do so and pointed you in the direction of where you can gain or access some support and resources to enable you to do that.